Margaret, there's something I need to tell you about Uncle Pete. My 14-year-old grandson Tommy's voice carried an urgency I'd never heard before as he gripped my kitchen table, his knuckles white with tension. For weeks I'd noticed him watching Pete Morrison with the intensity of a hawk studying its prey, but I'd dismissed it as teenage awkwardness around my late husband's oldest friend. What Tommy revealed that afternoon would shatter 30 years of trust and expose a predator who'd been hiding behind grief and friendship, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Chen, and at 73 years old, I thought I'd seen every shade of human nature during my decades as a high school guidance counselor in Portland, Oregon. I'd helped troubled teenagers navigate family abuse, dealt with manipulative parents, and learned to spot the warning signs of predatory behavior from miles away. What I never expected was to become a target myself, vulnerable in ways I'd never imagined possible. The foundation of this story begins with loss, as so many dangerous situations do. My husband Robert died 18 months ago after a brief but brutal battle with pancreatic cancer. One day we were planning our 50th wedding anniversary celebration, and 6 weeks later I was sitting alone in a funeral home, trying to make sense of a world that suddenly felt too big and too quiet for one person. Robert and I had built our life together like a fortress. We'd raised 2 children in our craftsman home on Maple Street, survived job losses and health scares, and created routines that made us feel invincible against whatever challenges might come. Every morning for 47 years, Robert brought me coffee in my favorite blue mug while I read the newspaper aloud to him. Every evening we walked 3 miles through Laurelhurst Park, discussing our days and planning our tomorrows. Our life had rhythm, purpose, and the kind of deep companionship that made other couples envious. When cancer stole Robert from me, it didn't just take my husband. It dismantled our entire way of living, leaving me adrift in a house full of memories and routines designed for 2 people. The coffee maker sat unused, because coffee for one seemed pointless. The evening walks stopped because talking to myself felt too much like admitting I was truly alone. Even grocery shopping became an exercise in loneliness, standing in aisles designed for families while calculating portions for a single person. That's when Pete Morrison stepped into the vacuum left by Robert's absence, and at first his presence felt like a gift from heaven. Pete had been Robert's college roommate, best man at our wedding, and godfather to our children. For 5 decades he'd been Uncle Pete to our family, the bachelor friend who brought elaborate gifts at Christmas and told stories that made everyone laugh until their sides hurt. He'd been there for every major milestone, every celebration, every crisis that required an extra pair of hands or a shoulder to cry on. Pete was 68 years old, recently retired from his job as a bank manager, and what my generation would call a distinguished gentleman. Silver-haired with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, he dressed in pressed slacks and button-down shirts that suggested reliability and respectability. He'd never married, dedicating his life instead to his career and maintaining friendships that spanned decades. Robert used to joke that Pete was the most dependable man alive, someone who remembered birthdays, showed up when he said he would, and never let a friend down in times of trouble. 3 weeks after Robert's funeral, Pete appeared at my front door with a casserole and an offer to help with anything I needed. The gesture seemed natural, expected even. Robert would have done the same thing if Pete had been the one to pass away first. What widow wouldn't be grateful for a familiar face, offering practical assistance during the most difficult period of her life? Pete's help began with small reasonable offers that any friend might make. He offered to handle the lawn maintenance that Robert had always managed, explaining that he enjoyed yard work and had plenty of time on his hands. When my kitchen faucet started dripping persistently, Pete arrived with tools and expertise, fixing it in 20 minutes while sharing stories about home repair projects he'd tackled over the years. These gestures felt like friendship, like family, like the natural support system that kicks in when tragedy strikes a community. Within a month, Pete had established a routine of visiting twice a week, usually on Tuesday evenings and Saturday afternoons. He'd bring dinner from my favorite restaurant or ingredients to cook something simple, always insisting that eating alone was unhealthy and that Robert would want someone looking after my well-being. We'd sit at my dining room table, the same table where Robert and I had shared thousands of meals, and Pete would fill the silence with gentle conversation about neighborhood happenings, mutual friends, and memories of better times. Initially, these visits provided comfort I desperately needed. Grief has a way of making time move strangely, with hours crawling by like wounded animals while entire weeks disappear without notice. Pete's presence created structure in my shapeless days, giving me something to look forward to, and someone to talk with besides my own reflection. He listened patiently when I cried about missing Robert, never suggesting that I should be moving on or feeling better by now. His constancy felt like a life preserver thrown to someone drowning in an ocean of loneliness. But something shifted during the third month of these regular visits. Pete's behavior became subtly different in ways that were hard to pinpoint or articulate. He began arriving unannounced, explaining that he'd been in the neighborhood and thought he'd check on me. These surprise visits often coincided with times when I was vulnerable, perhaps fresh from the shower with my hair still wet, or late at night when I was already in my robe preparing for bed. Pete would apologize for the poor timing while his eyes lingered just a moment too long, making me self-conscious about my appearance in ways I hadn't felt in decades. His conversation also began including comments that felt inappropriate but were delivered so casually that questioning them seemed unreasonable. He'd mention how lonely it must be sleeping in a big bed by myself, or comment that I was still an attractive woman who shouldn't spend her golden years alone. These remarks made me uncomfortable, but Pete always framed them within concern for my well-being, making me feel foolish for reading anything inappropriate into words spoken by someone who'd been like family for 50 years. The most unsettling change was Pete's increasing familiarity with my personal space and belongings. He'd comment on photographs I'd moved or books I'd been reading, demonstrating knowledge about changes in my home that suggested he'd been paying very close attention during his visits. He began touching me during conversations, placing his hand on my shoulder or arm, in gestures that lasted just long enough to feel invasive while remaining brief enough to seem innocent. When I stepped away from these touches, Pete would look hurt and confused, as if I were rejecting kindness, rather than defending boundaries I couldn't even properly explain to myself. My discomfort grew when Pete started making suggestions about my financial security and living arrangements. He'd mention articles he'd read about elderly women being targeted by scammers, offering to help me review my accounts and legal documents to ensure everything was properly protected. When I politely declined these offers, Pete would express concern about my ability to manage such complex matters alone, especially during a time when grief might be affecting my judgment. His persistence felt pushy rather than helpful, but again he framed everything within genuine concern for my welfare. The situation became more troubling when Pete began questioning my independence in subtle but consistent ways. He'd express worry about me driving alone, especially at night, and offer to accompany me on errands or appointments. When I mentioned plans to visit friends or attend social events, Pete would suggest that I might be taking on too much too soon, that isolating myself might be healthier than forcing myself into social situations before I was emotionally ready. His advice consistently pushed me toward greater dependence on him while discouraging connections with other people in my life. During this same period, my relationship with my children became strained in ways that confused and hurt me deeply. My daughter Lisa lived in Seattle with her own family, visiting monthly when her work schedule allowed. My son Michael had moved to Denver years earlier for his job, maintaining regular phone contact but managing only occasional visits. Both of them had been supportive immediately after Robert's death, but as months passed, our conversations became stilted and uncomfortable. Lisa seemed particularly distant during her visits, cutting them shorter than usual and avoiding the long conversations we'd always shared. When I mentioned how helpful Pete had been during my adjustment period, Lisa's expression would tighten, and she'd change the subject abruptly. I interpreted her reaction as jealousy or resentment that someone outside the family was providing support she felt unable to offer due to distance and responsibilities. Michael's phone calls became less frequent, and when we did speak, he seemed distracted and eager to end our conversations. He'd ask perfunctory questions about my health and activities, but didn't engage with my answers the way he used to. When I shared news about Pete's kindness and the comfort his visits provided, Michael would respond with non-committal sounds that suggested disapproval or disinterest. I began to feel that my children were pulling away just when I needed them most, leaving me more dependent on Pete's friendship and support. What I didn't understand at the time was that Pete had been carefully manipulating these relationships, undermining my connections with family members through subtle comments and deliberate misinformation. During conversations with Lisa and Michael, Pete would mention concerns about my emotional state, suggesting that I was more fragile and dependent than I actually was. He'd describe incidents that painted me as confused or unreliable, always framing his comments as loving concern rather than criticism. Pete told Lisa that I'd been calling him frequently in the middle of the night, crying and expressing fears about living alone. He mentioned to Michael that I'd gotten lost driving to familiar places, requiring his assistance to get home safely. These stories were complete fabrications, but they were delivered with such apparent sincerity and worry that my children began to question my competence and independence. Pete's decades-long relationship with our family lent credibility to his concerns, making my children wonder if grief had affected my judgment more severely than they'd realized. The most damaging manipulation involved Pete's suggestions about my relationship with Robert. He began telling Lisa and Michael that I'd shared intimate details about my marriage that suggested I'd been unhappy for years, implying that Robert's death might actually be a relief despite my public grief. These lies created emotional distance between my children and me, as they struggled to reconcile the mother they knew with the woman Pete described. Instead of questioning Pete's motives, they began questioning my authenticity, wondering if my grief was genuine, or if I was using their father's death as an opportunity to gain attention and sympathy. Meanwhile, Pete's behavior toward me continued escalating in ways that made me increasingly uncomfortable but were difficult to address directly. He began commenting on my physical appearance with inappropriate familiarity, mentioning how my clothing looked on me, or suggesting changes to my hair or makeup that would make me more attractive. These comments were always delivered as compliments or friendly suggestions, making me feel ungrateful for finding them invasive and inappropriate. Pete also started bringing gifts that felt too personal for a family friend to give.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
He'd arrive with expensive perfume, explaining that he'd seen it advertised and thought the scent would suit me. He brought silk scarves and jewelry that seemed more appropriate for a romantic relationship than a friendship based on shared grief and decades of family connection. When I tried to refuse these gifts or suggest they were too extravagant, Pete would look wounded and explain that giving me pleasure helped ease his own grief over losing Robert. The physical boundaries Pete tested became more problematic as his visits continued. He'd hug me hello and goodbye with embraces that lasted too long and included unwanted touching. He'd sit closer to me during dinner conversations, often placing his hand on my knee or thigh while talking, as if such contact was natural and expected. When I moved away from these touches, Pete would apologize for being forward while explaining that physical affection was important for emotional healing, especially for people our age who'd spent decades in loving marriages. Most disturbing were the comments Pete began making about intimacy and companionship. He'd mention how difficult it must be for me to sleep alone after sharing a bed with Robert for nearly 50 years. He'd suggest that physical affection was a basic human need that shouldn't be ignored just because of age or circumstances. These conversations made me deeply uncomfortable, but Pete always presented them as concern for my emotional and physical well-being, rather than inappropriate advances from someone taking advantage of my vulnerability. The situation reached a crisis point during a Saturday afternoon visit in early November. I'd been battling a mild cold and was feeling tired and congested when Pete arrived with soup and offers to take care of me. I appreciated the gesture but wanted to rest, so I suggested we postpone our usual dinner together until I was feeling better. Pete insisted that I needed looking after, especially when I was unwell and alone. He prepared the soup while I rested on the living room couch, bringing me a bowl along with tissues and medicine he'd found in my bathroom cabinet. The gesture seemed thoughtful, but I was disturbed that Pete had gone through my private belongings without asking permission. When I questioned his familiarity with my bathroom, Pete laughed and explained that he'd been looking out for me long enough to know where everything was, as if such knowledge was natural rather than intrusive. After I'd finished eating, Pete suggested I needed to rest properly and offered to help me get comfortable. Before I could protest, he was arranging pillows behind me and pulling a blanket over my legs, his hands lingering on my body in ways that felt intimate rather than caring. When I tried to create distance, Pete seemed hurt and confused, asking if I didn't trust him to take care of me the way Robert would have wanted. The conversation that followed revealed the depth of Pete's inappropriate expectations and the danger I was actually facing. He began talking about how natural it was for people to find comfort with each other during difficult times, especially people who'd known each other as long as we had. He mentioned that Robert would understand if we found solace in each other's company, that friendship could evolve into something deeper when circumstances called for it. Pete's words made it clear that he viewed my grief and vulnerability as an opportunity to pursue a relationship I'd never invited or encouraged. When I firmly explained that I wasn't interested in anything beyond friendship, Pete's demeanor changed in frightening ways. His voice became harder, more insistent, as he argued that I was being unrealistic about my future. He pointed out that I was an elderly woman living alone, financially comfortable but physically vulnerable, and that his interest in me was more than I was likely to receive from anyone else. Pete suggested that I was being foolish to reject companionship that could benefit both of us, especially when my own children seemed too busy with their lives to provide adequate support. The most chilling moment came when Pete made it clear that he'd been planning this progression for months. He mentioned details about my daily routines, my financial situation, and my relationships with Lisa and Michael that he couldn't have known through casual friendship. Pete had been observing me carefully, learning my vulnerabilities, and positioning himself as indispensable while systematically undermining my other relationships. What I'd interpreted as grief-motivated kindness was actually calculated manipulation designed to isolate me and make me dependent on his attention. That night, after Pete finally left following my repeated requests for him to go, I lay awake feeling scared and confused about everything that had transpired. I couldn't shake the feeling that Pete's behavior represented a fundamental violation of trust, but I also struggled with doubts about my own judgment. Was I overreacting to kindness from a family friend who was also grieving Robert's loss? Had my months of isolation made me paranoid about normal human contact? Pete's long history with our family made it difficult to accept that his motives might be predatory rather than genuinely caring. The next few days brought a barrage of phone calls, flowers, and notes from Pete, all apologizing for any misunderstanding while insisting that his concern for me was genuine and appropriate. He explained that grief sometimes made people say things they didn't mean, implying that my rejection of his advances was a temporary emotional response rather than a clear boundary. Pete's messages consistently reinforced the narrative that he was a caring friend being misunderstood by a widow whose judgment was compromised by loss and loneliness. What made Pete's manipulation so effective was his ability to exploit my genuine grief and the social expectations surrounding widowhood. Society expects elderly widows to be grateful for any attention or assistance, especially from longtime family friends who stepped up during times of need. Questioning Pete's motives felt like ingratitude towards someone who'd provided practical help and emotional support when I needed it most. His decades-long relationship with Robert and our family created a presumption of trustworthiness that made his predatory behavior seem impossible to anyone who didn't witness it firsthand. Pete also understood that elderly women face particular vulnerabilities when reporting inappropriate behavior. My complaints about a respected, longtime family friend would likely be dismissed as confusion, paranoia, or attention-seeking behavior from someone struggling with grief and adjustment to living alone. Pete's reputation in the community as a gentleman and his apparent concern for my well-being created plausible deniability for behavior that would be immediately recognized as predatory if directed toward a younger woman. The isolation Pete had helped create made the situation even more dangerous. My strained relationships with Lisa and Michael meant I had no close family members to confide in or ask for help. The friends I'd shared with Robert had gradually drifted away, partly due to the natural awkwardness of socializing with half of a couple they'd known together, and partly due to Pete's subtle discouragement of my social connections. I was exactly where Pete wanted me, alone and dependent on him for companionship and assistance, with no support system to turn to when his true intentions became clear. The week following Pete's inappropriate advances was filled with anxiety and second-guessing that made normal activities feel overwhelming. Every unexpected noise made me wonder if Pete was arriving for another unannounced visit. Every phone call created fear that his voice would be on the other end, pushing boundaries I'd tried to establish. I found myself checking door locks obsessively and avoiding windows where Pete might see me moving around the house. The home that had been my sanctuary for decades suddenly felt exposed and unsafe. Pete's persistence during this period was both relentless and strategically calculated. Rather than respecting my clearly stated boundaries, he intensified his contact while carefully maintaining plausible deniability for his behavior. He left voicemails expressing concern about my well-being and confusion about what he'd done wrong, positioning himself as a caring friend, being unfairly rejected rather than a predator whose advances had been appropriately rebuffed. The gifts escalated in both frequency and intimacy during this time. Pete left flowers at my front door with notes apologizing for any misunderstanding while reaffirming his deep affection for me. He had groceries delivered with cards explaining that he was worried about me taking care of myself properly. Most disturbing were the personal items, lingerie and bath products that arrived without explanation, sending a clear message about Pete's expectations while maintaining enough ambiguity that he could claim innocent intentions if confronted. During one particularly frightening incident, I returned home from a doctor's appointment to find Pete waiting in my backyard. He explained that he'd been worried when I didn't answer the door and had decided to check if something was wrong. Pete claimed he'd used the spare key I'd given him months earlier for emergencies, justifying his presence in my private space as concern rather than trespassing. The fact that he'd been inside my home without permission while I was away felt like a profound violation that left me questioning my safety, even in supposedly secure spaces. That evening, Pete called to apologize for startling me while insisting that his concern was justified given my recent withdrawal from his friendship. He mentioned specific details about my appearance and behavior during recent days that suggested he'd been watching my house, monitoring my activities, and tracking my routines in ways that went far beyond normal neighborly concern. Pete's knowledge about my private life was extensive and frightening, revealing a level of surveillance that made me realize how carefully he'd been planning his approach. The psychological impact of Pete's behavior was devastating in ways I hadn't anticipated. Beyond the immediate fear and discomfort, his actions undermined my confidence in my own judgment and my ability to navigate relationships safely. If someone I'd known and trusted for 50 years could harbor such predatory intentions, how could I trust my assessment of anyone else's character? Pete's betrayal didn't just threaten my physical safety, it shattered my faith in the social connections that had sustained me throughout my adult life. Sleep became elusive as my mind replayed every interaction with Pete, searching for warning signs I should have noticed earlier. I found myself questioning years of family gatherings, wondering if Pete's bachelor status and devotion to our family had hidden inappropriate intentions that I'd been too naive to recognize. The memories I'd treasured as evidence of Pete's loyalty and friendship now felt contaminated by the possibility that his motives had always been more complex and disturbing than I'd realized. The most painful aspect of the situation was the way Pete's manipulation had damaged my relationships with Lisa and Michael just when I needed their support most. The lies he'd told them about my emotional state and competence had created distance and distrust that would be difficult to repair, especially when the truth about Pete's behavior seemed so improbable. How could I explain that their godfather, a man they'd known and respected their entire lives, had been systematically grooming me for sexual exploitation while undermining our family relationships? As November progressed and Pete's behavior became increasingly aggressive and intrusive, I realized that my situation was far more dangerous than I'd initially understood. This wasn't simply a misunderstanding between old friends that could be resolved through clear communication and boundary setting. Pete's actions revealed a calculated predator who'd been planning his approach for months, using his knowledge of my vulnerabilities and his position of trust within our family to isolate me and make me dependent on his attention. The most terrifying realization was that Pete had no intention of accepting my rejection of his advances. His persistence despite my clearly stated boundaries, his escalating surveillance and intrusion into my private space, and his systematic undermining of my other relationships all suggested someone who viewed my consent as irrelevant to his plans. Pete had invested too much time and effort in positioning himself as indispensable to simply walk away when his true intentions were exposed and rejected. By the time Tommy made his urgent declaration about Pete coming to hurt me, I was already living in a state of constant anxiety and hypervigilance that was taking a severe toll on my physical and emotional well-being. What I didn't know was that my grandson had been conducting his own investigation into Pete's behavior, observing patterns and gathering information that would prove crucial to my safety. Tommy's warning would arrive just in time to prevent a situation that could have ended in tragedy, but first, Pete's manipulation would reach its most dangerous phase yet. Tommy's warning came during what should have been an ordinary Thursday afternoon in late November. I was arranging chrysanthemums in a vase when I heard his skateboard wheels hitting the pavement outside my kitchen window. At 14, Tommy was all elbows and knees, with Robert's same thoughtful brown eyes and a stubborn streak that reminded me of myself at that age. He'd been stopping by regularly since his grandfather's death, usually after school or on weekends, bringing homework questions or simply wanting to spend time in the house where he'd created so many childhood memories. But this visit felt different from the moment Tommy burst through my front door without his usual cheerful greeting. His face was flushed with exertion and something that looked like fear, his normally confident posture replaced by nervous energy that had him shifting his weight from foot to foot. When he spoke those words about Pete coming to hurt me, his voice carried an authority that made me set down the flowers and give him my complete attention. "Margaret, I've been watching him, and something's really wrong." Tommy's words tumbled out in a rush as he pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking slightly as he scrolled through what appeared to be photographs and notes. "I know you think I'm just being paranoid because I don't like him hanging around here, but it's more than that, way more than that." Tommy had always been observant, the kind of child who noticed when adults were upset even when they tried to hide it, who remembered conversations and picked up on subtleties that other kids missed completely. Robert used to say that Tommy would make an excellent detective someday because he paid attention to details that most people overlooked. But I'd dismissed Tommy's obvious discomfort around Pete as typical teenage awkwardness around elderly adults, never imagining that his instincts were picking up on genuine danger. "Show me what you mean, sweetheart." I sat down at my kitchen table, gesturing for Tommy to join me. Whatever had prompted this urgent visit clearly wasn't something he could explain quickly or casually. Tommy spread his phone and a small notebook across the table, organizing his evidence with the methodical precision of someone who'd been thinking about this problem for weeks. He'd been tracking Pete's visits to my house, noting the times he arrived and left, the frequency of his appearances, and patterns that had emerged over the months since Robert's death. "Look at this, Grandma." Tommy showed me a calendar he'd created on his phone, with Pete's visits marked in red dots. "See how it started out twice a week, always the same days, but now look at November." The red dots had multiplied dramatically, showing visits nearly every day, often multiple times per day. And see these times, some of these are really late at night or really early in the morning. What kind of friend visits someone at 11 at night or 6 in the morning? I studied Tommy's documentation, feeling a chill of recognition as I saw the pattern laid out so clearly. Pete's escalating presence in my life had felt gradual and natural when I was experiencing it day by day, but seeing it mapped out visually revealed a disturbing progression that was anything but normal or innocent. "That's not even the weird part," Tommy continued, switching to photographs on his phone. "I started taking pictures because I wanted to prove to Mom and Dad that something was wrong, but they said I was being dramatic and that Uncle Pete was just helping you through a hard time." These photos show Pete in locations around my neighborhood where he had no reasonable business being. The first photograph showed Pete sitting in his car across the street from my house on a day when he hadn't visited officially. The timestamp indicated it was taken on a Tuesday afternoon when I'd been at a dentist appointment. The second photo captured Pete walking around my backyard, apparently examining my windows and doors while I was away. A third image showed him following my car at a distance as I drove to the grocery store, maintaining just enough space to avoid being obvious while clearly tracking my movements. Tommy, how long have you been taking these pictures? The implications of his surveillance were both impressive and frightening. My 14-year-old grandson had been conducting a more thorough investigation into Pete's behavior than I'd managed myself. About 6 weeks, he admitted. Ever since I noticed him sitting outside your house when he thought nobody was around. At first I thought maybe he was just worried about you and checking to make sure you were okay, but then I started seeing him other places too. Like at the grocery store you go to, and outside the library when you have book club, and even near Mom's work once when I was waiting for her after school. The revelation that Pete had been monitoring my activities beyond our arranged visits sent waves of terror through me. I'd been aware of his increasing intrusion into my home and personal space, but I hadn't realized the extent of his surveillance or the fact that he was tracking my movements throughout the community. Pete had been creating a comprehensive picture of my daily routines, learning my vulnerabilities, and probably planning his next moves based on information gathered through stalking. But Tommy wasn't finished with his evidence. He showed me screenshots of Pete's social media activity that revealed even more disturbing patterns. Tommy had friend-requested Pete months earlier, back when Pete's behavior seemed simply supportive rather than predatory, giving him access to posts and information that Pete probably thought were invisible to our family. Look at his Facebook posts from the last few months, Tommy said, scrolling through Pete's timeline. See how he talks about you. It's like he thinks you're already his girlfriend or something. He posts pictures of flowers and says things like brightening a special ladies' day and writes about cooking dinner for his dear friend like you're dating or whatever. Reading Pete's social media posts from Tommy's phone made me nauseous. Pete had been presenting our relationship to his online friends as a romantic courtship, describing our dinners together as dates and referring to me with endearments that suggested intimacy I'd never invited or reciprocated. He'd posted photographs of my house and garden that he'd taken without permission, along with captions that implied he had proprietary feelings about my property and my life. Even worse were the comments Pete had made on posts from other people, revealing attitudes toward elderly women and relationships that were deeply disturbing. He'd responded to articles about widowhood with suggestions that older women needed male protection and guidance, implying that independence wasn't realistic or healthy for women of my generation. Pete had also engaged with content about inheritance and estate planning in ways that suggested he viewed elderly women's financial resources as opportunities rather than personal assets to be respected. Tommy had also documented conversations he'd overheard between Pete and other adults at community events, family gatherings, and chance encounters around town. Pete had been telling people that he was helping me through my grief and that our friendship was developing into something deeper and more meaningful. He'd described me as dependent on his assistance and grateful for his companionship, painting a picture of our relationship that bore no resemblance to reality. The most chilling discovery Tommy had made involved Pete's history with other elderly women in the community. Through careful observation and some internet research that impressed me with its thoroughness, Tommy had identified 3 other widows Pete had befriended over the past decade. In each case, Pete had followed a similar pattern of increasing involvement in the woman's life, followed by financial transactions that had transferred significant assets to Pete's control. Mrs. Patterson from Oak Street died 2 years ago, and Uncle Pete inherited her house even though she had grown children, Tommy explained. Mrs. Rodriguez moved into assisted living last year, and Pete somehow ended up with power of attorney over her finances. And Mrs. Walsh, the lady who used to live near the park, she disappeared completely about 3 years ago, just sold everything and moved away, but some of the neighbors said Pete had been spending a lot of time with her before she left. Tommy's research had uncovered a pattern of predatory behavior that extended far beyond his inappropriate pursuit of me. Pete had apparently been targeting vulnerable elderly women for years, using the same tactics of friendship and assistance to gain access to their lives and finances. The fact that multiple women had either died under questionable circumstances or disappeared after becoming involved with Pete suggested a level of criminal activity that made my situation exponentially more dangerous than I'd realized. "Grandma, I think he's planning to do something really bad to you, and I think it's going to happen soon." Tommy's voice dropped to a whisper as he showed me the final piece of evidence he'd gathered. Yesterday after school, I followed him to a hardware store, and I watched him buy zip ties, duct tape, and some kind of sedative stuff from the pharmacy section. He paid cash for everything and made sure to go to different cashiers so nobody would see all the stuff together. The image Tommy showed me from the hardware store parking lot made my blood freeze. Pete was clearly visible loading his purchases into his car, items that had no innocent explanation when purchased together by someone who'd been stalking and manipulating an elderly woman for months. The zip ties and duct tape suggested plans for physical restraint, while the pharmacy purchases implied he intended to drug me into compliance with whatever he had planned. "I have to call the police right now," I said, reaching for my phone with hands that were shaking so badly I could barely manage the numbers. But Tommy grabbed my wrist, stopping me before I could complete the call. "Wait, Grandma, I already tried calling them last week when I first saw him buying weird stuff, but they said they couldn't do anything because he hasn't actually committed a crime yet. They said stalking laws are complicated and that family friends have more freedom to visit and help than strangers would. But I have a different plan, and I think it's the only way to catch him and make sure you're safe." Tommy's plan was both brilliant and terrifying in its simplicity. He'd been thinking about Pete's behavior patterns and had identified the most likely scenario for when Pete would make his move. Based on his surveillance, Tommy believed Pete was planning to act during one of my routine activities when I would be predictably alone and vulnerable. "Tomorrow night is book club at the library, and you always stay late to help Mrs. Jenkins clean up," Tommy explained. "Uncle Pete has been timing your schedule, and I think he's planning to be waiting for you when you get home. He knows you'll be tired and probably won't be expecting anyone, and he knows I won't be here because Friday nights I usually stay at Josh's house." The plan Tommy proposed required careful coordination and significant risk, but it offered the best chance of catching Pete in the act while ensuring my safety. Tommy would hide in my house before I left for book club, positioning himself where he could observe and record Pete's actions while remaining hidden and safe. He'd use his phone to document everything Pete did, creating evidence that would be impossible for police to dismiss or ignore. "I'll call 911 the second he tries to hurt you or break into the house," Tommy promised. "And I'll have everything recorded so there's proof of what he was planning to do. But we have to be really careful because if he realizes I'm here, he might try to hurt both of us." The courage my 14-year-old grandson was showing in the face of genuine danger made me incredibly proud and terrified at the same time. Tommy was willing to put himself at risk to protect me, demonstrating the kind of loyalty and love that Pete had been systematically trying to undermine and destroy. But the plan also meant potentially exposing Tommy to a dangerous predator who'd already proven himself capable of long-term manipulation and potentially violent intentions. We spent the next hour refining Tommy's plan, identifying the safest hiding spot in my house, and establishing communication protocols that would allow him to call for help without alerting Pete to his presence. Tommy would position himself in my upstairs linen closet, which offered a clear view of the main floor while providing concealment and a secondary escape route through the upstairs bathroom window if necessary. The most difficult part of the plan was acting normal around Pete during the intervening time. I had to maintain the pretense that I remained unaware of his true intentions while being constantly vigilant about my safety. Pete called that evening to confirm our usual Friday dinner plans, and I forced myself to sound pleased about seeing him while my stomach churned with knowledge of what he was actually planning. Friday morning arrived gray and cold, with November rain that matched my mood as I prepared for what might be the most dangerous day of my life. Tommy arrived at school time as usual but circled back an hour later, slipping into my house through the basement door while I kept watch for any sign of Pete's unexpected arrival. We tested the communication system we'd established, making sure Tommy could hear my movements throughout the house and that his phone would transmit clear video from his hiding position. The hardest part was maintaining normal routines while knowing that Pete was probably watching and planning his approach. I went to the grocery store, attended my regular coffee date with neighbors, and prepared for book club as if it were an ordinary Friday. But every shadow seemed to hide potential threats, and every unexpected sound made me wonder if Pete had decided to deviate from Tommy's predicted timeline. Pete called twice during the day, ostensibly to check on my plans and confirm that I was feeling well enough for my evening activities. Both conversations felt different now that I understood his true motives, with questions that seemed designed to verify my schedule rather than express genuine concern for my well-being. Pete's voice carried an undertone of excitement that made my skin crawl, as if he was looking forward to evening activities that had nothing to do with the innocent dinner he'd supposedly planned. By late afternoon, Tommy was positioned in his hiding spot with his phone fully charged and emergency numbers programmed for immediate dialing. We'd rehearsed various scenarios, planning responses for different ways Pete might approach the house and different levels of threat he might present. Tommy understood that his primary job was documentation and communication with police, not direct intervention that could put him in greater danger. I left for book club at my usual time, driving carefully and checking my mirrors constantly for any sign that Pete was following me. The library felt like a sanctuary where I could temporarily forget the danger waiting at home, but I found it difficult to concentrate on our discussion or participate in the usual social conversations that typically energized me. Every glance at the clock reminded me that Tommy was alone in my house, waiting for a confrontation that could turn violent without warning. Book club ended at 9 o'clock as usual, and I helped Mrs. Jenkins arrange chairs and clean up with the automatic movements of someone whose mind was entirely focused elsewhere. The drive home felt both endless and too short, as I approached the moment when months of manipulation and stalking would finally come to a head. My house looked normal as I pulled into the driveway, with only the porch light illuminating the front door and no sign of Pete's car in the immediate vicinity. But Tommy had warned me that Pete would probably park several blocks away and approach on foot to avoid being seen by neighbors who might remember his presence later. I sat in my car for several extra minutes, giving Tommy time to confirm Pete's location and prepare for whatever was about to unfold. The key turned easily in my front door lock, and I stepped into the hallway with deliberately casual movements that would appear normal to anyone watching from outside. But my heart was pounding so hard I was sure the sound would be audible throughout the house, and every nerve in my body was alert for signs of danger or intrusion. I'd been home for less than 5 minutes when I heard the unmistakable sound of my back door handle being tested by someone trying to enter quietly. The sound was followed by scratching noises that suggested lock-picking or the use of tools to gain entry without triggering obvious signs of forced entry. Pete was attempting to break into my house exactly as Tommy had predicted, confirming that his intentions went far beyond inappropriate romantic advances. From my position near the front stairs, I could hear Tommy moving carefully in his hiding spot above me, presumably positioning his phone to record Pete's illegal entry and whatever actions followed. The knowledge that my grandson was nearby provided some comfort, but it also intensified my fear because any mistake in our plan could put both of us in mortal danger. The back door opened with a barely audible creak, followed by footsteps that were clearly trying to remain silent but were still detectable on my hardwood floors. Pete was inside my house, illegally, moving with the confidence of someone who'd been planning this intrusion and knew exactly what he intended to accomplish. The sound of his movements made my skin crawl as I realized how many times he'd probably been inside my home without permission, learning the layout and identifying potential obstacles to whatever plan he'd developed. "Margaret, I know you're home." Pete's voice carried through the house with a tone I'd never heard before, low and threatening rather than the gentle familiarity I'd grown accustomed to over months of manipulation. "I saw your car in the driveway, and I know you're not asleep because the lights are still on downstairs. We need to have a conversation about your future, and it's time you started listening to reason." The transformation in Pete's voice and demeanor was terrifying because it revealed the authentic personality he'd been hiding behind months of careful acting. This was the real Pete Morrison, angry and entitled and dangerous in ways that made me understand how previous victims had been overpowered and controlled. The gentle family friend who'd brought casseroles and offered assistance was completely gone, replaced by a predator who felt ownership over my life and my choices. I stayed silent, hoping Pete would reveal more of his intentions while Tommy recorded evidence that would be impossible for authorities to dismiss. But Pete's patience had apparently run out after months of careful manipulation, and he began moving through my house with the confidence of someone who knew I had nowhere to run and no one to call for help. "You've been avoiding me for weeks, and that's going to stop tonight," Pete announced as his footsteps approached the living room where I was standing frozen beside my favorite chair. "I've invested too much time and effort in this relationship to let you throw it away because you're scared of moving forward. You're going to realize that I'm the best thing that's happened to you since Robert died, and you're going to start showing some gratitude for everything I've done." When Pete appeared in my living room doorway, he looked like a stranger wearing the face of someone I'd known for 50 years. His usual neat appearance was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled and his hair unkempt in ways that suggested he'd been under significant stress. But most disturbing were his eyes, which held an intensity and anger that made me step backward instinctively toward the stairs where Tommy was hidden. The items Tommy had seen Pete purchase were visible in a canvas bag he carried, confirming that tonight's intrusion was planned as more than conversation or persuasion. Pete intended to use physical force to achieve compliance with whatever demands he was about to make, and the presence of restraints and sedatives suggested a level of violence that could easily escalate to murder if his plans were resisted. "We're going to sit down like civilized people and discuss your future," Pete said, gesturing toward my dining room table with movements that made it clear this was a command rather than a suggestion. "You're going to listen to some hard truths about your situation, and then you're going to make some decisions that will benefit both of us. The days of you acting like an independent woman are over. Margaret, it's time you accepted reality about what your life looks like now." Pete's transformation from concerned family friend to controlling predator was complete, revealing months of careful planning and manipulation that had been building toward this moment of absolute domination. He'd systematically isolated me from my family, undermined my confidence and independence, and positioned himself as my only source of support and companionship. Now he was ready to collect on the investment he'd made in my vulnerability, using force to achieve the compliance he'd been unable to secure through manipulation alone. But Pete had made one critical miscalculation in his planning. He'd underestimated my grandson's intelligence and determination, failing to recognize that Tommy's discomfort around him reflected genuine perception of danger rather than typical teenage awkwardness. Pete had no idea that every word he spoke was being recorded, every action documented, and every threat preserved as evidence that would destroy his carefully constructed reputation and ensure his prosecution for crimes that had probably claimed multiple victims over the years. The confrontation that followed would test every ounce of courage I possessed and reveal reserves of strength I hadn't known existed. But for the first time in months, I wasn't facing Pete's manipulation alone. Tommy's presence upstairs gave me hope that this nightmare would finally end, and that justice would be served for not only my suffering but for the other women Pete had victimized over the years. What happened next would change everything, exposing the full extent of Pete's criminal behavior and ensuring that his decades of predatory manipulation finally faced consequences. But it would also test the bond between my grandson and me in ways that would prove stronger than any threat Pete could possibly pose. The sound of police sirens in the distance told me that Tommy's call for help had been received and that backup was finally arriving. Pete's expression changed from confident control to panic as he realized his carefully planned assault was about to be interrupted by authorities, who would find him in my home illegally, carrying items that proved his violent intentions beyond any reasonable doubt. The next few minutes would be chaos, but they would also be justice, and they would prove that sometimes the most unlikely heroes come in the form of 14-year-old grandsons who refuse to let evil triumph over the people they love. The police sirens grew louder as they approached my neighborhood, and I watched Pete's face transform from predatory confidence to desperate panic. He dropped the canvas bag containing his restraints and sedatives, the items scattering across my hardwood floor, like evidence of crimes not yet committed. His eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for escape routes that didn't exist, and I could see his mind calculating whether he had time to flee before authorities arrived. "You called them," he accused, his voice rising to a level that bordered on hysteria. "After everything I've done for you, after all the time I've invested in helping you through your grief, you betrayed me to the police like I'm some kind of criminal." Pete's sense of entitlement was staggering even in the face of certain arrest. He genuinely seemed to believe that his months of manipulation and stalking constituted kindness that I should have appreciated rather than criminal behavior that deserved prosecution. The delusion that it allowed him to justify his actions to himself was complete, making him incapable of recognizing the harm he'd inflicted or the danger he'd posed to my safety and well-being. The sound of car doors slamming in my driveway was followed by heavy footsteps on my front porch and the authoritative knock of law enforcement officers responding to Tommy's emergency call. Pete made one last desperate attempt to control the situation, grabbing my arm with a grip that would leave bruises and hissing threats about what would happen if I told the police anything other than that his visit had been a misunderstanding between old friends. But Tommy's voice cut through Pete's threats from the top of the stairs, clear and strong and filled with the kind of courage that made me incredibly proud to be his grandmother. "Let go of her right now," he commanded, his phone visible in his hands as he continued recording Pete's assault. "The police are here, and I've got everything you did on video. There's no way you're talking your way out of this." The front door opened before Pete could respond to Tommy's challenge, and 3 uniformed officers entered my house with the swift efficiency of professionals responding to a domestic violence call. The lead officer immediately assessed the situation, taking in Pete's grip on my arm, the scattered restraints on the floor, and Tommy's position at the top of the stairs with his phone trained on the scene below. "Ma'am, are you injured?" The officer's question was directed at me, but his eyes never left Pete, whose hand was still wrapped around my arm in a grip that had tightened rather than loosened when the police arrived. "Do you know this man, and did you invite him into your home tonight?" Before I could answer, Pete launched into the explanation he'd probably been rehearsing for weeks, presenting himself as a concerned family friend who'd become worried when I didn't answer my phone after book club. He claimed he'd used his emergency key to check on my welfare, discovering me in a confused and agitated state that suggested I might be having medical or psychological problems related to my recent widowhood. Pete's performance was masterful, complete with tears and expressions of genuine concern that would have been convincing to anyone who hadn't witnessed his transformation from gentle friend to dangerous predator. He spoke with the authority of someone who'd known me for decades, referencing specific details about my health and emotional state that lent credibility to his claims about my supposed confusion and his justified worry about my well-being. But Tommy wasn't about to let Pete's lies go unchallenged. He descended the stairs with his phone extended toward the officers, his young voice steady and clear as he explained what he'd recorded and why he'd been hiding in my house with a predetermined plan to document Pete's criminal behavior. "Officer, I've been investigating this man for weeks because I knew he was planning to hurt my grandmother," Tommy said, his words carrying the weight of someone who'd done his homework and gathered irrefutable evidence. "I have videos of him stalking her, photos of him buying restraints and drugs, and I just recorded him breaking into her house and threatening her when she tried to avoid him." The lead officer accepted Tommy's phone and spent several minutes reviewing the evidence while his colleagues secured Pete and began questioning him about his presence in my home. What Tommy had captured was devastating to Pete's claims of innocent concern, showing his illegal entry, his aggressive behavior, and his explicit threats about controlling my future and ending my independence. The officer's expression grew increasingly grim as he reviewed Tommy's documentation, pausing at images that showed Pete stalking me around town and purchasing items that had no innocent explanation when considered together. When he reached the audio recording of Pete's threats inside my house, his jaw tightened with the recognition that this was far more serious than a simple misunderstanding between elderly friends. "Mr. Morrison, you're under arrest for breaking and entering, stalking and attempted assault." The officer's words were crisp and professional as he read Pete his rights while his colleague applied handcuffs. "You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly advise you to exercise that right until you can speak with an attorney." Pete's protests grew increasingly frantic as he realized that his carefully constructed explanation wasn't going to protect him from the evidence Tommy had gathered. He demanded to speak with my children, claiming they would vouch for his character and confirm that I'd been behaving erratically since Robert's death. Pete insisted that Tommy was a troubled teenager whose accusations shouldn't be taken seriously, especially when they came from someone too young to understand the complexities of adult relationships and grief counseling. But the physical evidence scattered across my floor told a different story than Pete's claims of innocent concern. The zip ties, duct tape, and sedatives he'd purchased created a narrative of planned violence that no amount of character references could explain away. Combined with Tommy's video documentation and the clear signs of illegal entry into my home, Pete's arrest was inevitable regardless of his reputation in the community or his history with my family. As the officers prepared to transport Pete to jail, one of them sat down with Tommy and me to begin taking our official statements about the months of escalating harassment and manipulation that had led to this confrontation. Tommy's notebook and phone provided a detailed timeline that painted a clear picture of predatory behavior, while my account of Pete's increasingly inappropriate advances filled in the emotional context that explained why I'd felt unable to seek help earlier. The officer was particularly interested in Tommy's research into Pete's relationships with other elderly women in the community. Recognizing that the pattern suggested a serial predator who'd been operating successfully for years before finally targeting someone with a protector observant enough to recognize the danger. Plans were already being made to investigate the deaths and disappearances Tommy had identified, with the possibility that Pete's crimes extended far beyond stalking and attempted assault. The most emotional moment came when Lisa and Michael arrived after receiving Tommy's call about the police activity at my house. I watched my children's faces as they processed the news that their godfather, a man they'd trusted and respected their entire lives, had been systematically manipulating and stalking their mother while undermining their relationships with me through lies and psychological manipulation. Lisa broke down completely when she learned how Pete had convinced her that I was becoming confused and dependent, making her feel that her attempts to maintain close contact were somehow harmful to my emotional recovery. Michael's anger was immediate and intense as he realized that Pete's supposed concern about my well-being had been calculated manipulation designed to isolate me from my family's protection and support. The guilt my children felt about believing Pete's lies and allowing distance to develop between us was heartbreaking to witness. They blamed themselves for not recognizing the signs of his manipulation, for not trusting their own instincts about changes in my behavior, and for failing to protect me when I needed them most. But Tommy helped them understand that Pete's manipulation had been sophisticated and deliberate, designed to exploit their love for me and their natural concern about my adjustment to widowhood. Over the following weeks, as Pete's case moved through the legal system, more details emerged about the extent of his criminal activity and the number of elderly women he'd victimized over the years. The investigation Tommy had initiated uncovered financial fraud, elder abuse, and at least 2 suspicious deaths that were now being reviewed as potential homicides rather than natural deaths from age-related causes. Mrs. Patterson's death, which had initially been attributed to a heart attack, was reopened when investigators discovered that Pete had been the sole beneficiary of her will despite having no family relationship with her. The document had been changed just weeks before her death, during a period when neighbors reported that Pete had been visiting her daily and that she'd seemed increasingly confused and withdrawn from her usual social activities. Mrs. Rodriguez's transfer to assisted living was also revealed to be more complex than initially apparent. Pete had convinced her family that she was no longer capable of independent living, using his position as her financial power of attorney to liquidate her assets and place her in a facility where she had minimal contact with relatives who might question his management of her estate. When investigators interviewed Mrs. Rodriguez directly, they discovered that her supposed cognitive decline had been greatly exaggerated and that she'd been pressured into signing documents she didn't understand. Most disturbing was the case of Mrs. Walsh, whose sudden departure from the community now appeared to be the result of coercion rather than a voluntary decision to relocate. Investigators found evidence that Pete had been systematically draining her bank accounts while convincing her that family members were trying to steal her money and that her only safety lay in cutting ties with everyone except him. Mrs. Walsh's current whereabouts remained unknown, raising the possibility that Pete's manipulation had escalated to kidnapping or worse. The revelation that Pete had been operating as a serial predator for at least a decade sent shockwaves through our community and sparked conversations about elder abuse that had been long overdue. Other families began coming forward with stories about elderly relatives who'd been befriended by helpful strangers, only to suffer financial losses or social isolation that had seemed inexplicable at the time. Tommy became something of a local hero as news of his investigation and courage spread throughout our neighborhood and school district. His teachers were amazed by the sophistication of his surveillance techniques and evidence gathering, while his classmates were impressed by his willingness to put himself at risk to protect his grandmother. But Tommy remained humble about his role, insisting that he'd simply done what any family member should do when they recognize that someone they love is in danger. The psychological impact of Pete's betrayal continued to affect me long after his arrest and the resolution of the immediate danger he'd posed. The man I'd trusted as a family friend for 50 years had been planning to assault, possibly murder me for financial gain and psychological satisfaction. The violation of trust was profound, affecting not just my ability to feel safe in my own home but my confidence in my judgment about people's character and motivations. Therapy became an essential part of my recovery process, helping me understand that Pete's manipulation had been sophisticated enough to fool anyone in my vulnerable position. The counselor explained that predators like Pete specifically target people during periods of grief and transition, when normal support systems are disrupted and victims are more likely to accept help from sources they might otherwise question. The legal proceedings against Pete stretched over several months, during which Tommy and I both testified about his pattern of escalating harassment and manipulation. Pete's attorney attempted to portray him as a grieving friend whose concern for my well-being had been misinterpreted due to my emotional instability following Robert's death. But the evidence Tommy had gathered was overwhelming, and Pete's own recorded words inside my house made his violent intentions impossible to deny. The most satisfying moment came when Pete was sentenced to 20 years in prison for multiple counts of elder abuse, fraud, stalking, and attempted assault. The judge specifically mentioned Tommy's courage and investigative skills in her comments, noting that his intervention had likely prevented a serious violent crime and possibly saved my life. Pete's conviction also led to policy changes in our community regarding the protection of elderly residents and the monitoring of suspicious relationships between older adults and much younger acquaintances. The local police department developed new protocols for investigating reports of elder abuse, while social service agencies began offering educational programs about recognizing and preventing financial and emotional manipulation of vulnerable adults. For me, the most important outcome was the restoration of my relationships with Lisa and Michael, who now understood that Pete's lies had been designed to isolate me from the people who truly cared about my well-being. We spent many hours talking through the months of manipulation and miscommunication, rebuilding trust that Pete had systematically tried to destroy for his own benefit. Tommy and I developed an even closer relationship through our shared experience of recognizing and defeating a dangerous predator. His willingness to trust his instincts about Pete's behavior, despite adult dismissal of his concerns, taught me valuable lessons about listening to young people who notice things that adults miss or ignore. Tommy's courage in the face of genuine danger showed me that heroism comes in many forms, including 14-year-old grandsons who refuse to let evil triumph over the people they love. Today, nearly a year after Pete's arrest, I'm living independently again with confidence in my ability to recognize and respond to potential threats. I've returned to many of the social activities and volunteer commitments that Pete had subtly discouraged, rebuilding connections with friends and community organizations that had been systematically undermined during his campaign to isolate me. Most importantly, I've learned that accepting help during difficult times doesn't require surrendering independence or judgment to people who claim to know what's best for me. Real support empowers rather than diminishes, encourages rather than discourages, and respects boundaries rather than systematically violating them in the name of care or concern. Tommy's warning that afternoon may have saved my life, but it also taught me that family loyalty and love are stronger than any manipulation or threat that predators can devise. Sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones who refuse to accept that evil is inevitable, who trust their instincts even when adults dismiss their concerns, and who are willing to put themselves at risk to protect the people they love. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.